4 rivers, 4 civilizations, and the same basic bargain every time. A river floods. It leaves behind soil you can farm. Farming that soil at scale requires organization, so you get cities, and then writing to keep track of it, and then kings, and then armies, and eventually somebody else's army. This one has no river. It has a sea, studded with hundreds of islands. It has mountains that come down almost to the water. It has thin, rocky soil that will grow olives and vines and not much else, and a coastline so broken and so long that no single power can easily hold all of it. Nothing about it says this should be the birthplace of anything, and yet what happened here produced the alphabet you are reading this in, the word politics, the word history, the word philosophy, and a poem about a war that people are still arguing about 3,000 years later. But before any of that, it produced the most complete collapse in this entire series. Not a conquest, not a slow decline, a total systems failure that took down every palace in the region within a generation or two and left the survivors so far below where their grandparents had been that they lost the ability to write. Not the language, the whole technology. For roughly 400 years, nobody in the Aegean could read. And when writing finally came back, it was a completely different system, borrowed from foreigners, with no memory whatsoever of the one that had been lost. This is the story of the Minoans, the Mycenaeans, and the 4 centuries of darkness in between. Start with the geography, because it explains almost everything. If you are farming the Nile floodplain, your wealth comes out of the ground. You can be self-sufficient. You have very little reason to get in a boat. The Aegean does not offer that. The soil is poor and the flat land is scarce. What it offers instead is proximity. Nowhere in the Aegean is very far from water, and the islands are close enough together that a Bronze Age ship can hop between them without ever losing sight of land. So wealth here does not come from growing things, it comes from moving things. Copper from Cyprus, tin from somewhere far to the east, gold, ivory and grain from Egypt, timber and textiles and painted pottery going the other way. That single fact shapes everything that follows. A river civilization can survive in isolation. A trading civilization cannot. It is only as strong as the network it sits inside. Hold on to that, because in about 20 minutes it is going to matter enormously. The first great power here was on Crete, the largest island in the Aegean, sitting across the southern approaches like a gate. In 1900, a British archaeologist named Arthur Evans began digging at a site called Knossos and found something nobody expected. Not a fortress, not a temple. An enormous, sprawling, multi-story complex of hundreds of interconnected rooms, corridors, staircases, storerooms and open courts, covering something like 20,000 square meters. He called it a palace, and he called the people who built it the Minoans, after Minos, the legendary king of Crete from Greek mythology. Both of those names are guesses. We have no idea what these people called themselves, and no strong evidence that a single king ruled from that building. The word Minoan is a 19th century invention that stuck. Evans also did something that still divides archaeologists. He did not just excavate Knossos. He reconstructed large parts of it in concrete, with painted columns and restored frescoes, based on his own interpretation of the evidence. Visit today, and much of what you photograph is Evans. Some of it is probably right. Some of it is definitely his imagination. What is not in doubt is how sophisticated the place was. Knossos had light wells cut down through multiple stories to bring daylight into interior rooms. It had drainage, including terracotta pipes tapered to speed the flow of water and stop sediment settling, which is a genuinely advanced piece of hydraulic thinking. It had storage magazines lined with enormous ceramic jars, big enough to hold a person, holding oil and grain and wine on a scale that clearly served more than one household. That last detail tells you what these buildings actually were. Not primarily royal residences, redistribution centers, produce came in from the surrounding countryside, was recorded, stored, and sent back out. The palace was the economy's central node. And then there are the frescoes, which are the reason the Minoans have the reputation they do. Dolphins, blue monkeys, lilies, women in elaborate flounced dresses with elaborate hair, processions, and most famously, young figures vaulting over the horns of a charging bull, one grasping the horns, one mid-somersault across its back, one landing behind. Nobody knows for certain what the bull scenes depict, a sport, a religious rite, an initiation, or an artistic convention that never literally happened. Modern bull handlers generally consider the maneuver shown to be impossible as painted, which may mean the artists were stylizing something real or inventing something entirely. It is bright, fluid, curved, and strikingly unwarlike. Compare it to an Assyrian palace relief of prisoners being impaled, and you are looking at two completely different ideas of what art is for. There is another thing missing from Minoan sites, and it is a big one. Walls. The palace complexes on Crete were not fortified. No ramparts, no towers, no gates built to be defended. This has produced a very popular picture of the Minoans as a peaceful, art-loving, sea-trading society that did not need defenses because their fleet kept everyone away. I want to be careful here. In the same way I was careful about the Indus, Minoan art includes weapons. Minoan burials include swords. There are fortified sites elsewhere on Crete. The absence of palace walls is real and unusual and worth explaining, but the leap from unfortified palaces to peaceful civilization is a leap, not a finding. The Minoans also wrote. Two scripts, in fact, one usually called Cretan hieroglyphic and a later one called Linear A. We cannot read either of them. Linear A has been recovered from across Crete, mostly on clay tablets used for administration. We know roughly how many signs it has. We can even guess at the sound values of some of them, because a later script borrowed its shapes. What we cannot do is understand the language underneath, because it does not appear to be Greek, and it does not appear to be related to anything we know. So for the second time in this series, we have a sophisticated civilization whose own words are sitting in museum cases, perfectly preserved and completely closed. And then, somewhere in the 16 or 1500s BCE, the island of Thera exploded. Thera, now called Santorini, sits about 100 kilometers north of Crete. The eruption was one of the largest in human history, blowing the center out of the island and leaving the crescent-shaped caldera that tourists photograph today. On Thera itself, the town of Akrotiri was buried under meters of volcanic ash, which preserved it in astonishing detail. Multi-story buildings, plumbing, wall paintings of ships and fishermen and blue monkeys, and no bodies, almost none, no valuables left behind either. The people of Akrotiri appear to have had enough warning, probably from earthquakes, to gather what mattered and leave. Where they went, we have no idea. Now the tempting story is that this eruption destroyed the Minoans. Ash, tsunami, collapse, the end. The evidence does not support it. Minoan civilization continued for a considerable period after Thera. Knossos kept operating. The eruption was a catastrophe, and it certainly damaged Cretan coastal settlements and shipping, but the civilization absorbed it and carried on. What eventually ended Minoan independence was not a volcano, it was people. Around 1450 BCE, the Cretan palaces were destroyed, and when Knossos comes back into use, something has changed. The administrative tablets are no longer in Linear A. They are in a new script, Linear B. The Mycenaeans had arrived. The Mycenaeans were the mainland power, based in the Peloponnese and central Greece, and where the Minoans built open palaces, the Mycenaeans built citadels. Their walls are the first thing anyone notices, constructed from limestone blocks so large that later Greeks, looking at the ruins, could not imagine humans lifting them, and concluded they must have been built by Cyclopes. We still call the technique Cyclopean masonry. At Tiryns, the walls are over 7 meters thick. At Mycenae itself, the main entrance is crowned by 2 carved lionesses, flanking a column, standing above the gateway for over 3,000 years and still there today. It is the oldest monumental sculpture in Europe, and it was never buried and never lost. Every Greek who walked past it in the classical period saw the same carving you can see now, already ancient to them, already unexplained. In 1876, Heinrich Schliemann excavated a circle of shaft graves inside those walls and found gold, diadems, cups, weapons, and a series of thin gold funeral masks beaten to the shape of a face. Schliemann, who was hunting for Homer's heroes, identified one as the death mask of Agamemnon. It is a wonderful story, and it is wrong. Those graves are around 3 centuries too early for any plausible Trojan War. The mask is genuine and remarkable. The name is not. The Mycenaeans were, in a way the Minoans do not appear to have been, a warrior society. Weapons in graves, boars' tusk helmets, chariots, fortifications on a scale that implies people worth fortifying against, and they left us tablets, thousands of them, in Linear B. For decades nobody could read them, and the assumption was that they would turn out to record the same unknown language as Linear A. Then, in 1952, an English architect named Michael Ventris announced that he had cracked it. Ventris was not a professional classicist. He was an amateur working obsessively in his spare time, applying pattern analysis he had partly learned from wartime code-breaking work. And the answer he arrived at was one nobody was ready for. Linear B was Greek, not a lost language, not a relative. Greek, written 500 years before anyone thought Greeks were writing anything, in a clumsy syllabic script badly suited to the language, but unmistakably Greek. The names of gods later worshipped in classical temples are on those tablets. Poseidon, Athena, Dionysus. It pushed the documented history of the Greek language back half a millennium in a single stroke. Ventris did not get to enjoy it for long. 4 years after the announcement, weeks before the book that laid out the decipherment in full was published, he was killed in a car crash at the age of 34. He remains one of the few people in this entire series who successfully read a script nobody else could, and one of the very few whose name we know because of it. And here is the deflating part, which by now you should be expecting. The tablets are inventories. Sheep, counted so precisely that one archive tracks flocks numbering into the tens of thousands, broken down by location and by the shepherd responsible. Wheel counts, including a memorable entry listing chariot wheels as unserviceable. Bronze allocations, perfumed oil, lists of women and children assigned to workshops with their daily rations, names of officials and the exact quantities they were responsible for. There is no literature, no poetry, no history, no law, no letters, just accounting, kept by professional scribes, filed and stored and updated. We only have them because the palaces burned. Unfired clay tablets are fragile and were probably meant to be recycled after the year's accounts were settled. Fire baked them hard. Every Linear B tablet we possess survives because the building it was in was destroyed. The picture those inventories paint is of an economy of extraordinary centralization. A ruler called the Wonax at the top, officials beneath him, villages assigned production quotas, raw materials issued to named craftsmen, and finished goods accounted for on return. Everything measured, everything logged, everything routed through the palace. It was efficient. It was also, in a way nobody involved could have seen, appallingly fragile. Take out the palace and there is nothing underneath it. No independent markets, no merchant class operating outside the system, no local institutions that could keep functioning on their own. Remove the center and the entire structure has nothing left to stand on. Around 1200 BCE, somebody removed the center. And not just here, this is the part that makes the Late Bronze Age collapse different from anything else in this series. Look across the eastern Mediterranean in the decades either side of 1200 BCE. The Hittite Empire, one of the great powers of the age, disappears. Its capital is burned and abandoned. The wealthy trading city of Ugarit on the Syrian coast is destroyed and never reoccupied. And Ugarit left something behind that is genuinely chilling. Excavators found a batch of clay tablets still sitting in the kiln, unfired, never sent. One of them is a letter from the king to an ally, reporting that enemy ships have been sighted, that his own fleet is away, that his troops are away, and asking what he should do. The city burned before the letter was baked. We are reading a request for help that was never delivered, preserved by the fire that answered it. Cities across the Levant and Cyprus burn. Egypt survives, but only after fighting off invasions it describes on temple walls, and it emerges permanently weakened and never regains its former reach. And in Greece, one after another, the Mycenaean citadels burn. Pylos, Mycenae, Tiryns. Within roughly a generation, the palace system that had run the Aegean for 4 centuries simply ceases to exist. An entire interconnected world of literate, bureaucratic, palace-based kingdoms went down more or less together. What caused it? This is genuinely one of the great open questions in ancient history, and I am going to give you the honest state of the debate rather than a tidy answer. The oldest explanation is invasion. Egyptian records describe a coalition of raiders they call the Sea Peoples, arriving by land and sea, destroying everything in their path. For a long time, this was the standard account. The problem is that the Sea Peoples look increasingly like a symptom rather than a cause. Displaced populations moving because something had already gone badly wrong at home. Climate evidence has strengthened considerably. Pollen cores and other proxies from the eastern Mediterranean point to a period of significant drought around this time, lasting decades. Sustained crop failure would produce famine, migration, and desperate people on the move, which fits what the records describe. Earthquakes have been proposed, and there is destruction damage at several sites consistent with seismic activity, though not a coordinated region-wide event. And then there is the systems argument, which I find the most persuasive as a framework rather than a single cause. These kingdoms were not independent. They were nodes in a tightly coupled international network of trade, diplomacy, and marriage alliances. Bronze itself makes the point. Bronze is copper alloyed with tin, and tin in the Bronze Age Mediterranean came from a very long way off. No tin, no bronze. No bronze, no weapons, no tools, no elite goods to redistribute. So you have a set of highly centralized, highly specialized states, each dependent on long-distance supply chains, each with no economic layer beneath the palace to fall back on. Hit that with drought and raiding and the loss of a trade route or two, and the failures do not stay contained. Each collapse removes a partner and makes the next collapse more likely. It is not one cause. It is a cascade through a system with no redundancy. What follows in Greece is what historians used to call the Dark Age, and now more cautiously call the Early Iron Age, partly because the darkness was always partly our own inability to see. But something real did happen, and it was severe. Settlements shrink, and many are abandoned entirely. Population estimates suggest a dramatic decline. Monumental building stops completely. Pottery becomes simpler and more local as long-distance exchange dries up. Contact with Egypt and the Near East thins to almost nothing, and the writing stops. Not gradually. Linear B vanishes. There is no late clumsy Linear B, no simplified version, no inscriptions on pots by people half remembering it. The last tablets are the ones baked in the palace fires, and after that, nothing. Which makes complete sense once you understand what Linear B was for. It was not a general-purpose technology for communication. It was an administrative tool operated by a small professional class for the exclusive purpose of running palace accounts. Nobody wrote letters in it. Nobody wrote stories in it. When the palaces burned, the reason for the skill vanished, the scribes were not replaced, and within a generation or two there was nobody left who could do it. That is how a civilization loses writing, not through conquest or suppression, but by having the knowledge confined to specialists doing one job and then removing the job. For roughly 4 centuries, the Aegean is silent in a way Mesopotamia never was even at its worst. But something did survive, and it survived in the only medium left. People kept telling stories about a great expedition across the sea, about walled cities and bronze armor and kings with names like Agamemnon and Nestor. Generation after generation, spoken aloud, reshaped in the retelling, held together by rhythm and formula, because that is how oral poetry stays memorable. And around the 8th century BCE, when writing returned, someone wrote them down. The Iliad and the Odyssey describe a world 400 years gone, and the extraordinary thing is that they get details right that nobody in the 8th century could have known. Homer describes a helmet made from rows of boar's tusks sewn onto leather, an object that had not been used for centuries when he was composing, and that archaeologists later dug up exactly as described. There are other examples. Mixed in with those are anachronisms. Iron where there should be bronze, burial customs from the poet's own era. It is not a documentary. But threads of genuine Bronze Age memory made it through 400 years of illiteracy carried entirely in people's heads, which is a remarkable thing for human memory to have managed. And the script that finally wrote them down was not Greek in origin at all. The Phoenicians, traders from the Levantine coast, used an alphabet, roughly 24 signs, 1 per consonant. Compared to hundreds of syllabic signs or thousands of logograms, it was astonishingly economical, and unlike Linear B, it did not require years of specialist training. Greeks encountered it through trade in the 9th or 8th century BCE and adopted it, and in doing so, they made one modification that mattered enormously. The Phoenician script marked consonants and left vowels to be inferred. Greek does not work that way, so the Greeks took several Phoenician letters for consonantal sounds Greek did not use and reassigned them to vowels. That gave them a system where every sound in the spoken language had a written sign, fully explicit, learnable in a matter of weeks rather than years. And that changed who could write. Linear B was for scribes serving a palace. An alphabet is for anyone. Within a couple of centuries of its adoption, you get lyric poetry, philosophy, drama, history, and political argument written by people who were not professional bureaucrats, because writing was no longer a profession. So let me put the uncomfortable version of this to you. The collapse was catastrophic. Cities burned, populations crashed, an entire literate civilization was wiped out, and the survivors spent 4 centuries poorer and more isolated than their ancestors. And it may have been necessary. The palace system was a dead end, all wealth and all record-keeping routed through a single center, with writing locked inside a bureaucratic caste. Nothing in that system was going to produce a philosopher, because nothing in it had any use for one. When Greece re-emerged, it rebuilt on a completely different pattern. Not palaces, but hundreds of small independent city-states, quarrelsome and competitive, with an alphabet anyone could learn. That is the soil the classical world grew out of, and it could only exist because the old order was gone so completely that nothing survived to be restored. Egypt endured for 3,000 years and stayed recognizably itself. Mesopotamia was conquered endlessly and kept being copied. China never broke the thread at all. The Aegean is the one that broke completely, lost everything, and came back as something else entirely. Sometimes the thread breaking is the whole point. But there is one more, and it is the strangest of all. because it happened on the other side of the world with no contact whatsoever with anything in this series. While Greece was in its dark age, people in the rainforests of Central America were independently inventing writing, not borrowing it, inventing it from nothing for the 5th time in human history. They also worked out the concept of zero centuries before Europe did and built a calendar so precise it tracked cycles running millions of days into the future. Then their greatest cities were abandoned to the jungle and nobody has fully explained why. That's next.